Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akiridulali. The headlines. Russian President Vladimir Putin announces partial mobilization of the military in Russia starting today. Accuses Western nations of trying to destroy Russia. UN Secretary General meets Ukraine's Prime Minister, discusses efforts to avoid global food crisis as world leaders gather in New York City for the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly. And Western nations condemn Russian plans for referenda in areas they control in Ukraine. We begin the program this morning with news out of Russia, where President Vladimir Putin seems to have called the bluff of Western nations over his invasion of Ukraine. Just a very short while ago, in a televised national address, Mr. Putin announced a partial mobilization of the Russian military effective immediately with a view to bolstering troop numbers. He explains that the armed forces will draw on military reservists only and those who have completed national service. He also promised that they will be provided with additional training along with all the benefits due to people involved in active duty. There have been immediate reactions to this news as the U.S. ambassador in Kiev described this as a sign of failure and vows that the United States would continue to support Ukraine's resistance towards what he described as Russian aggression. The UK's Foreign Office Minister Gillian Keegan has also described Mr. Putin's threat to the West, that he has lots of weapons, as chilling, adding that the address was more of Mr. Putin's lies. He added that Mr. Putin's comments should be taken, quote, seriously, and also urged for calm in the face of his threats in his speech to use nuclear weapons. For the first time in 3 years, world leaders gathered in person in New York City for the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres met with Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal of Ukraine and Ukraine's First Lady Olena Zelenska. According to a readout of their meetings, the Secretary General and the Prime Minister discussed the war in Ukraine and efforts to avoid a global food crisis, including the implementation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. With Ms. Zelenska, they discussed the importance of protecting Ukrainian women and children affected by the war. According to the readout, the Secretary General reiterated the UN's full support for continuing to provide humanitarian assistance. And the war in Ukraine has dominated much of the agenda of meetings where U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken pointed out that the war is a contributing factor to high rates of global food insecurity. Mr. Blinken painted a picture of an already grim food security landscape when Russia launched its war in Ukraine, adding that an agreement brokered by the United Nations and Turkey to open up the Black Sea to grain exports from Ukraine has helped the situation. Still, he said the UN-Turkey brokered agreement to resume grain export from Ukraine through the Black Sea should never have been necessary in the first place. Other speakers include Senegal's President Macky Sall and Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez. The leaders looked at ways to resolve the global food crisis, highlighting actions such as multilateralism, improved coordination, transparent trade environments, emergency food aid, and strengthening local food production systems to discuss further.
At the outset of 2022, conflicts, COVID-19, the effects of the climate crisis had already driven more than 190 million people into acute food insecurity. According to the World Food Program, President Putin's brutal war of aggression in Ukraine may add 70 million people on top of that, an already staggering number becoming even more staggering. That agreement should never have been necessary in the first place. The only reason it was is because Russia, having invaded Ukraine, was then blockading its ports and preventing food that had been feeding the world from getting out. But we had to deal with the reality before us, and the deal that was brokered by the United Nations with Turkey's assistance actually enabled the grain to start moving again.
Russia must end its illegal war against Ukraine, which has threatened an essential source of the world's food supply. The truth is that Putin is trying to blackmail the international community with a large part of the world's food needs.
And Mr. Blinken also spoke on the sidelines of the UN summit, saying that the US will never recognize Russia's plans to hold referenda in parts of Ukraine. Mr. Blinken added that the actions by Russian President Vladimir Putin showed his utter contempt and disdain for the United Nations. British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly echoed similar remarks afterwards and encouraged other countries to call out Mr. Putin's, quote, aggressive actions against the people of Ukraine. Russian installed leaders in occupied areas of 4 Ukrainian regions yesterday set out plans for a referenda on joining Russia, a challenge to the West that could sharply escalate the war and spark condemnation from Ukraine and its allies.
For the United Nations, for the General Assembly, for the United Nations Charter. The very principles that we're here to uphold this week in the Charter, sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, are what are being violently aggressed by Russia, including through the attempts to proceed with these referenda and putting even more forces into the effort to seize Ukrainian sovereign territory. I think it's also not a surprise that this is happening now. We've seen in the last weeks significant gains by Ukraine in taking back the land, its land, seized by Russian forces since the aggression began February 24th. It's also a time when Russia itself is seeing serious reverses on the battlefield, and even some of its closest partners are clearly raising their deep concerns about what Russia is doing and the consequences this is having for countries around the world. And I'd also say, none of this, the sham referenda, the potential mobilization of additional forces, is a sign of strength. On the contrary, it's a sign of weakness. It's the sign of Russian failure. Let me be very clear. If these referenda proceed, and if Russia purports to annex Ukrainian territory, the United States will never, never recognize it.
Romania's President Klaus Iohannis brought Russia's invasion of Ukraine at the same meeting and said there was, quote, no justification for bloodshed, destruction, and human suffering. Mr. Iohannis said that since February, more than 2.3 million Ukrainians have fled to Romania, where they are granted access to education, health services, and the labor market. According to him, Romania is trying to help manage the global food crisis and has assisted to export 4 million tons of Ukrainian grain.
There is no justification for a military aggression against a sovereign state. There is no justification for bloodshed, destruction, and human suffering. It is our joint responsibility to come together and uphold our common values as members of the United Nations. Democracy and universal human rights are legitimate aspirations for all humankind. We therefore need to act now and support all those who fight for freedom and democracy. Since the beginning of the conflict, over 2.3 million Ukrainians have crossed our borders. Romania has offered not only emergency assistance, but also medium and long-term support for those who decided to stay in our country with free access to education, health services, and the labor market. In addition, we offered direct humanitarian assistance and put in place a logistic hub for coordinating the international humanitarian assistance from the entire world. Weaponizing access to food and restricting it around the world are unacceptable. In order to support the Ukrainian economy and help manage the global food crisis, Romania has acted in a responsible way by facilitating the export of more than 4 million tons of Ukrainian grain, which represents 60% of the grain exported by Ukraine through our ports on the Danube and at the Black Sea since the beginning of the crisis.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of Romania for...
Let's talk now to Professor Tom Rosett. He's in Intelligence Studies, head of the Ukraine program, Norwegian Defense University College. He joins us virtually from Copenhagen in Denmark. Good morning to you, Tom. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your invitation.
Let's start with, it does appear as if the West expected what the Russian president announced this morning, the partial mobilization of reservists to the Russian military and his description of Western threats. But then this is no doubt an escalation of the situation on ground and seems to foreclose any possibility of any kind of negotiation at this stage. Is that a fair assessment of the situation?
Yes, Russia is now raising the stakes in the war. It's also increases the negative rhetoric, and of course it also escalates the situation on the ground, but not immediately. This mobilization will take some time before it's implemented into military effect.
But then, if the Russians are thinking of bringing in more troops into the conflict, and the Ukrainians on the offensive, like Mr. Blinken pointed out earlier on, those who were hoping that perhaps the UN General Assembly might be a point at which some of the world powers could draw two sides together, are seemingly building castles in the air.
Unfortunately, that's the case. The opposite is finding place, and the Russian government with Mr. Putin is seeking to throw more into the war and hope for a quick resolution, but it's only going to prolong the war, and the peace prospect is further away, unfortunately.
By the end of this week, we would have had this conflict now for about 7 months, and something that you're in Copenhagen, Denmark, therefore you're not directly in the line of fire or in the theater of conflict, shall we say, but Mr. Putin's reference to the use of nuclear weapons will bring in everybody, wouldn't it? Or is he just bluffing?
In the Russian narrative, it's important to portray the NATO as the main enemy to defend the increased mobilization of forces and convince the domestic population that this is a war against NATO, first and foremost. Although NATO is just providing arms, I think the danger of conflict between NATO and Russia is still low. It's in neither's interest to have such escalation of the war. I think it's rhetoric first and foremost. And threats to sort of make the West deviate from the current plan, but I think it's unfruitful. The Ukrainian and the Western initiative or involvement in this war is going to continue nonetheless.
Let's look at what seems to be happening without much noise here. It does appear as if broadly the world is returning to some kind of bipolarity. You've got the Western nations, NATO, the United States, Germany, France, Spain, and all the others on one side, the UK. And then on this other side now, you've got the Russians, the Chinese, to some extent, the Indians, and a couple of others like that. And that is beginning to play itself out in the open. We're hearing about military drills and exercises involving all these countries I've mentioned in various theaters, including in Taiwan, on the borders with China, and in Russia itself. Beyond the crisis in Ukraine, which is the current one that we're dealing with, are we perhaps overlooking the fact that while everybody's attention is focused on Ukraine, other things could be developing elsewhere?
A very good question, and yes, and there's tendencies towards sort of a democratic versus autocratic world, but it's not that simple either. We saw in Uzbekistan, in Samarkand, there was a meeting between Putin and others in the SCO, also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and both China and India had concerns about the war. My reading of that is they're increasingly critical of the Ukrainian war and Putin's involvement and the unsolved issue that's aggravating. And yes, that's the tendency that you describe, but it's I think the Chinese and Indian patience with Russia on this war is ending. Yeah.
Countries like Denmark, prior to this conflict, the start of this conflict in February, countries like Denmark, your home country there, were fairly neutral countries who didn't have to take sides in conflicts and wanted to get on mostly with, at best, their own development and then possibly European development. But they seem now to be drawn nilly-willy into some of the conflicts, perhaps, or burden conflicts in other places, and which may grow even after the one in Ukraine is resolved. Do you harbor any fears about your country being drawn into this?
I think NATO is first and foremost focused on Europe for the moment, and well, there could be another conflict somewhere that with a UN mandate that NATO or other countries could play a part in that. That's something Scandinavian countries usually obliged to and participate in. But after the Iraqi war and Libya, there's increased skepticism also in making military endeavors in foreign places unless there's a proper UN mandate.
Indeed. Tom Rosette, Professor of International Intelligence Studies, rather, at the Norwegian Defense University College in Copenhagen. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.
After the break, McDonald's reopens in Kiev for the first time since this war began. Please join us again. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. British Prime Minister Liz Truss and French President Emmanuel Macron have held a meeting on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York. After the meeting, the French leaders said France and Britain need to show that they are allies and friends, as the two leaders met face-to-face for the first time and just weeks after Ms. Truss questioned whether Paris was a friend or foe. Relations between the two powers have been difficult ever since Britain left the European Union. Both leaders discussed a range of topics, including the war in Ukraine and European matters, including a French proposal to create a European political community, which would invite non-EU European states to discuss common areas of interest. Mr. Macron has repeatedly said he hoped to persuade Britain to take part. However, while Mr. Macron appeared to offer an olive branch, a readout from PM Truss's office made no mention of bilateral ties. In September, Paris became furious at London for agreeing a trilateral deal with the United States to supply submarines to Australia, replacing plans for Canberra to buy French ones instead. And the situation on the front lines with Russian forces showed the initiative belongs to Ukraine, and that's according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He made the comments in his nightly video address a day after Russian-installed leaders in occupied areas of 4 Ukrainian regions set out plans for a referenda on joining Russia, a move that analysts think could sharply escalate the war. In concluding his video statement, Mr. Zelensky thanked international friends and partners of Ukraine for what he called their, quote, principled and firm condemnation of Tuesday's referenda announcement. In the meantime, President Zelensky says he would, quote, love to see the United States become the first country to sign a document that has Western countries providing security guarantees to Ukraine. He made the statement in a conversation with former U.S. President Bill Clinton at an event for the Clinton Global Initiative. During the conversation, he also called on the United States to deem Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, saying that other countries would follow if the U.S. made the first declaration.
There are results that you can already see in Ukraine, the deoccupation, the strengthened army of Ukraine. Our army has become stronger on the battlefield, our servicemen have become resilient, but they are resilient because of the gut feeling, because of the love, immense love towards the motherland. This is a very important, powerful document. It's very important in terms of political support of Ukraine, in terms of guarantees for the private sector, because guarantees are multifaceted, from military to political to economic. This is a good example for the country that is still not in NATO, but in spite of not being a NATO member, it still wants to live and it has to live. It's about the air defense, it's about food safety, all other things that are so relevant for the world today. I would love to see the United States to be the first country worldwide to sign this document on security guarantee with the Ukrainian country. Another important moment is to recognize Russia, and I think, by the way, this is the most important sanction so far, to recognize Russia the state sponsor of terrorism. This is what the United States of America can do. For the whole of the civilized world, the United States of America is an indicator of democracy. When you give us artillery, other governments and nations join giving us artillery pieces too. So when the USA recognizes the Russian Federation as the state sponsor of terrorism, other countries also in Europe will join in this initiative. So this is the answer to a question how the US could help or can be leaders pioneering this pressure on the Russian Federation.
Let's talk to Ambassador Humphrey Ojeko, Nigeria's former ambassador to Switzerland and the United Nations in Geneva. Of course, Ambassador Ojeko joins us virtually. Your Excellency, thank you for your time. Good morning.
Thank you so much for having me this morning. Thank you.
There's a lot happening at the same time. Let's start from the United Nations. A lot of meetings taking place on the sidelines of the General Assembly because, as you're aware, this will be the first time that most of the United Nations is able to reassemble in person. So a lot of people are doing catch up. Do you think Ukraine or issues with helping to resolve the crisis in Ukraine could be top of the agenda, or is this going to be an avenue to strengthen old alliances against each other?
No, thank you for bringing this up. You know that for the past 2 years, the United Nations General Assembly have been meeting virtually. So this is the first time, as we've observed, that they are meeting in person, and virtually every country is represented at the highest political level. That's a very good opportunity to begin to look at things. Of course, the issues of peace and security is the first call of the United Nations, which means that, yes, the assemblage of heads of states and governments stating the positions of their various governments. And so far, we have had those statements. The crisis, the war between the Russia and Ukraine, of course, is dominating the stage as it should, because it could degenerate into something that wasn't bargained for. We are hoping, since many of the countries that have not spoken out against the invasion of Ukraine are beginning to speak quietly and privately to Mr. Putin himself. If we've been listening recently during their economic summit meeting in some East European country, Putin himself confessed that he wasn't quite getting all the support he thought he would get from China. It's ambivalent. India, Prime Minister Modi was even more direct in saying this is not the era of war, and the various comments, statements delivered by various heads of states and government already in New York indicate that this is a time to sue for peace and not for escalation of this Ukraine-Russia war, which could lead to something the world didn't bargain for. In the midst of so many other difficulties they have to grapple with. So it is understandable these sidebar meetings taking place on various subjects, but especially in Ukraine. Let us hope something might come of it.
Well, Ambassador, the way you ended your comment there was one of optimism. But this morning, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a partial mobilization of his military, and the fact that he wants to bolster troop numbers. In the same address, he talked about Western blackmail to destroy Russia, and that that the West should note that Russia has nuclear weapons for the optimum time to be able to defend itself, perhaps pointing to calling the bluff that if you don't think we will use them, we can and we probably will if we are pushed. So when you put that against your note of optimism at the UN, the two both cannot happen, can they?
Indeed. For me, it is not strictly a note of optimism, more as that of realism. I do not think that Mr. Putin is a crazy person. He cannot be. He wouldn't be the head of a very important country like Russia if he was. First of all, when this war started, we warned that if it lasted for more than 30 days, Russia would be in a lot of difficulties, and those difficulties are beginning to show. Part of the reason for that is because I haven't personally seen any clear strategic objective that Russia is looking for in Ukraine. And again, we'll say this over and over again. Remember, it started with, NATO is encroaching too close to Russia. And it wasn't the case. It became that, if that was an issue, it would have become worse when Finland and Sweden joined NATO. Then it became, okay, the independence of the two Russia-speaking provinces of Ukraine, Donbass and Luhansk and all of that. And now we're hearing something else, a referendum for them not to be just independent countries, sovereign countries of their own anymore, but part and parcel of Russia. See, it's as if they're making it up as they go. And that is why everyone at the UN level really is questioning the real strategic objective of Russia in this place. Well, Putin is speaking from Moscow. Maybe when he begins to hear the voices of his own close allies, of his friends, the friends of Russia that were forming, maybe he will begin to think again. And the difficulty of mobilizing forces, I heard was like, it's not even recruitment, it is to kind of compel people to join the military, in order to be sent to Ukraine. If a country is beginning to do that, then it's going to have a lot of difficulties down the road. As for the nuclear black melting, when it gets to the stage of using nuclear weapons, Well, I do not think that's what Russia would choose to do at this time, because that, of course, is assured mutual destruction. Russia could destroy much of Europe and America, and Russia will probably cease to exist itself. So I do not think that would be a winning strategy for anyone. The bluff is there. On the same note, one would not agree that you should be declaring Russia as state sponsor of terrorism. I don't see how those could help. This is the moment for sober diplomacy, for quiet, sober, effective diplomacy to take place. This is not the time for saber rattling. I think we have crossed that stage. Russia's setback in the war should lead it into another direction.
You're Ambassador, you're a veteran diplomat, and I'm sure that in your time you've seen many, many drives for diplomacy, even in situations tougher than this. I mean, you were in the service when we had the Balkans War, which was also a European war, and the likes. How do you bring people who have, as it were, so much at stake, if you want to look at it that way, together to discuss diplomacy, especially when you have other people, interested parties, if you like, lining up behind them. So when you talk to the two parties, you are not actually talking to those who may be making the critical decisions. There are all these other people behind the scenes who may also be pulling the strings. How do you do that in terms of, enhanced diplomacy, if you like?
In fact, the question you ask is very pertinent. That's the very spirit and focus of the United Nations itself. In a situation where a member of the United Nations Security Council, a permanent member, is at war with some other country, that complicates the very foundational basis of Pacific settlement of disputes. So the thing here is Russia under Putin is losing a lot of friends and allies across the world. If one is listening, as I said, to the other heads of states and governments, even though what we hear in public may not be what they say privately, it is looking to me like that period of maturation is being reached when Putin will be getting suggestions quietly from the countries he considers friends of Russia. Those carry a lot of weight. If countries like India, like China, like Brazil, these are known emerging powers, and they have been sort of sympathetic to Putin's war, or at least they have not condemned it publicly. But that is without condemning it. They are now calling for peace. They are calling for peace negotiations. Yes, there is need for mediators. And you can see already that Erdogan of Tayyip Erdogan
Turkey.
Of Turkey was able to negotiate with Putin and with Ukraine under the auspices of the United Nations supervising. And they were able to reach the deal to be exporting grains from Ukraine to the rest of the world. And that is still holding. That is a pointer to what could be when such quiet diplomacy is embarked upon. And I think the United Nations General Assembly going on right now, where so many world leaders are present and involved, with all those sidebar meetings going on, I can tell you that is probably 80% of the conversations going on in various tables around New York right now. So it is not a question of optimism. In fact, it's a question of hope and focus that is the way the world global leadership should be going to now, to save Russia from the catastrophe that is hanging both on itself and the rest of the world because of this Ukrainian incursion. I do not see many countries that are going to be lining up behind another country annexing. Apparently, that's what this is. If the referendum is held and these two provinces of Ukraine become part of Russia, that's clear annexation in the 21st century. And I think that was what Macron of France was talking about when he was talking of the era of Russia embarking on some form of imperialism. Now, I do not even see countries like Iran, who are closer to Russia, supporting the annexation or the partition of Ukraine to benefit Russia. So at the end of the day, the message will be clear. And the military setbacks, as well as the optics of this whole thing, will also have impact in the domestic politics of Russia itself, where we have not been hearing voices saying, no, you can't do this or you can't. Those voices are beginning to be heard in Russia itself. The last time I heard about leaders from 18 different Russian provinces were already calling on Putin to either withdraw or to resign or stuff like that. That's not common fare in Russia. When it begins to happen, I think no leader can resist talking peace. This time has come, and we have a feeling that this is the time to begin to
do
strike.
that, indeed. Nigeria's former ambassador to Switzerland and the United Nations in Geneva, Ambassador Humphrey Ojako, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thanks.
Just before we take a break, Kiev residents have queued for hours outside McDonald's restaurants after the American fast food chain reopened 3 branches in the Ukrainian capital for the first time since Russia's invasion began nearly 7 months ago. The branches only opened for delivery services, but some customers were so excited that they waited outside to collect their meals from the couriers queuing next to them. According to some, the meals offered a taste of what life was like before the invasion and highlights a contrast to Russia, where McDonald's has pulled out its business after a Western backlash against the war. And coming up after the break, Valery Polyakov, record-breaking Russian cosmonaut, dies at the age of 80. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. You know what's next. At this time every day, during the week, during this program, we talk business coming out of this conflict, because even though there's war, there's always money to be made. Ini John McQuarrie joins me.
Money to be made or lost?
Or lost, indeed. Now, let's talk about the fares. The fares appear to be that there's coming recession, and it's not just one or the other country. It appears as if it's global.
Yes. The World Bank has warned that the world, except something drastic is done, there'll be global recession. That means it's going to involve everybody. And what would be driving that is the interest rate hike. Today, the Federal Reserve is meeting. They started yesterday, and they will most likely increase. I mean, I don't think there's any other way, because already we see the dollar has been gaining strength, and of course that has been affecting global market, has been affecting the price of oil, affects gold and everything. Tomorrow, the Bank of England is meeting, and they're expected to hike rates. EU, after I think about 7 years or so, they hiked rates this year. Nigeria, MPC, is meeting Monday,
week.
Tuesday. They're expected to hike rates. So everybody is dealing with inflation, and everybody is looking at how to deal with inflation by hiking rates. Now, the result of that is that access to fund is more expensive. That means there's no liquidity, because inflation obviously means there's a lot of money in circulation and all of that. So they try to mop that up by making it more expensive for people to have access to liquidity. And so it cuts down consumption. So it cuts down consumption. That means you don't have a lot of drive.
That's right. And there's no turnover. Industries are not getting to produce as much as they would produce. And all of that.
So there's reduced production, reduced demand, and then there's a kind of stall in the economy, which is what recession is. So the World Bank is saying that at this rate, that we might most likely see a global recession. Of course, that has its own consequences. Remember the time we had recession?
Yeah, that was COVID.
Yeah, was that COVID?
Yeah, no,
yes.
If we go far back, if we go
we
further
had one
back,
before
of course,
COVID, the
we
crash.
had before COVID,
yes.
during the crash.
And then we had the one that came with COVID. We recovered easily.
Yeah, from that, the one of COVID.
Yes.
This doesn't look like that.
It doesn't look like, because the core of production is being affected, which is energy. And it's everywhere. Energy, food being affected, agriculture, fertilizer. We talked about fertilizer yesterday being affected. So how do you get out of recession when the energy that is needed for production is too expensive?
And we haven't gotten to winter yet.
And
we've been talking about, especially for the countries in Europe who are dependent on either Ukraine for food or on Russia for energy. They've been trying to prepare for this, but we haven't actually gotten there yet.
We haven't gotten there, and yes, there are plans. A country like Germany has said they have about 90% of their storage full.
But they're using.
But they're
using. Even now, they're using part of that capacity.
They're using, exactly. That's a great point. They're using, because every day you're using. I saw a story in the UK that people may be going hungry just to be able to pay for energy bills.
Indeed.
You know, so how do you prioritize energy over food? Because if you're not alive, how do you get the...
what do you need being warm for if you can't eat and if you are not?
Exactly. So it's a very tight situation the world is edging into, and that's why the World Bank is saying that countries should start looking for how to boost production and maybe reduce focus on dealing with this inflation a bit. I mean, a country like the US, they have said, the Federal Reserve has said they are determined.
Indeed, they've made that comment very clear.
Turkey, that doesn't want to follow that trend, has its inflation at about 30% now. And we see what they are facing. They're having to hobnob with every other country to be able to survive.
Right.
You know, Turkey. So I don't know, but it's a fearful thing, because what it means is that while countries like the US may be able to maybe take care of their elite, have some subsidy, go to their storage, then the emerging economies who have
no storage, and
there's no hedge.
Very little purchase power, and so on. So again, you're going to have a large number of people who don't even know where to start.
Exactly. And because already as we speak, even before the recession, you already have the number of people who are going into poverty, who were starving, increasing. Because remember, we talked about the issue of humanitarian services.
That's right.
Moved to Ukraine.
To Ukraine, yeah, and tended to move all their focus as well.
Exactly.
Leaving those who were their traditional.
So you have drought also that has disturbed production. Even in countries like Turkey, they also have droughts that has disturbed their production. And in some African countries, they're also facing droughts, you know, so they can't even provide food for themselves. So by the time we now add recession to this, it's a scary picture.
It is. And probably if you want to know more about this scary picture, especially as it affects Nigeria, Ini and her crew will be on right after this on Business Morning and later on in the day with updates from Juliana in London and from Berlin and all of that. So please don't miss that. Thank you, Ini.
Thank you.
Let's take a quick look at the sports. Former Ukraine captain and coach Andriy Shevchenko has presented Poland skipper Robert Lewandowski with a special Ukrainian armband to be worn at the 2022 FIFA World Cup in Qatar. Lewandowski had been a vocal supporter of Ukraine following Russia's military invasion of the country and has previously worn a similar armband while playing for Bayern Munich last season.
First of all, I want to thank Robert for everything what he been doing for my country, and I give this armband for him. This armband represent as proud, represent the power, represent some attachment to Ukraine.
I know it that time when I wear first time this armband. If some people heard about what I did, for me will be also amazing feeling, amazing time, because I know that sport is also that people watch, for example, the football and a different sport as well. And if they know it, what's going on, for them will be easier to understand the situation.
Russian judokas will not compete at the World Judo Championships in Tashkent, despite the International Judo Federation being one of the few Olympic international federations allowing Russian athletes to appear in its events as neutrals. Athletes from Belarus and Russia are permitted to take part, as they did at the Ulaanbaatar Grand Slam, because the IGF has stopped short of fully implementing the IOC's recommendation to ban athletes from the two countries over the war in Ukraine. Ukraine boycotted the Grand Slam event in Ulaanbaatar over the presence of the Russians and had threatened to do the same for the World Championships. And finally on the program, a Russian cosmonaut who holds the record for the longest ever trip to space has died aged 80. Valery Polyakov spent 437 full days orbiting the Earth between 1994 and 95 on the Mir space station. He worked on experiments to see whether people could maintain their mental health if they were able to make a long journey to Mars. Tests found that there was no impairment of his cognitive function as a result of his 14-month expedition. Mr. Polyakov's death was announced by the Russian Space Agency, which used his honorary titles, including Hero of the Soviet Union and Pilot Cosmonaut of the USSR. The cause of his death was, however, not disclosed. That's our program this morning. Thanks for being with us. My name is Ladi Akiridoluale. Do watch out for updates at 5 o'clock within the world today. But for now, do have yourselves a pleasant midweek ahead. Good morning.